we want to talk about the last object that is left in the databases is the triggers, right? So what are the triggers and how do you use the triggers? There are several applications that triggers can be used. We're gonna see what is the basic concepts of the trigger, how it can be used for we can see one of the use cases of trigger. Okay, so trigger is nothing but the object in the SQL server. The objects that we have seen till now is tables, indexes, stored procedure, function, views, schema, right? All these are the objects. So this is the last one that we have to talk about is the trigger. Now the triggers are nothing but are the stored procedures, or you can say it as an automatic stored procedure. So the triggers are run automatically. You don't have to say I want to run the trigger, but with the function and the stored procedure you run when needed, right? The user has to run those, invoke those objects, but the triggers are the objects that are triggered in reaction to something else, you know. So let's say if you're doing an update on the database or delete on the database, then the trigger will fire if you have a trigger created on the objects that you're making changes. So the trigger fires in action to some things that you're doing on the database. Okay, so it invokes by itself when the certain conditions are met that you mentioned in the trigger, based on what kind of trigger it is. So it's an automatic. You don't have to run the trigger. You don't run the trigger. It's done by the logic that you have mentioned when you're creating the trigger. Okay, so that's why it's an automatic. You can say it's similar to automatic stored procedure. Okay, so the triggers are of two types. The one is the DDL trigger and the another is the DML trigger. So we're going to talk about the DML triggers. The DML triggers are whenever you're doing an insert, update or delete on the table, if you write a DML trigger on the table and you do insert, update and delete, the trigger will run. Now trigger can do several things. Whatever the logic you have mentioned inside the trigger will do that. So let's say if you inserted a record in the table and you want that record to be copied in some other table, you can have a trigger that copies the data from what you have inserted plus whatever logic you have built inside the trigger. It will update the another. So you don't have to make update to two places. You just make update to one and the update will be run into the other table. If you insert into one table, the other table will be inserted. So the trigger will do whatever defined inside the trigger based on insert, update and delete you do on the object or on the table, right? So the triggers are defined where? The triggers are defined on the tables that you have in the databases. The DML triggers are defined where? Are defined on the table. So if you look into the database and you look one of the tables, if you expand the table, you're going to see you have triggers in here. So the triggers are created on the table. So whenever you're creating a trigger on the table for DML, whenever you need to say I want to run this trigger when insert happens, update happens, delete happens, or combinations of any of these. Okay, not necessarily you have to do it for all. You can pick when you want the trigger to be run, when you insert, update or delete on the table. Okay, or either of the two or all three. Okay, so the trigger can have like so many. It can be used for auditing, it can be used for sending an email. So let's say you have a table which is an audit table, okay, that audits about if there is any inconsistency. So let's say you're running some stored procedure that checks all the table data is correct, all the data is consistent. If you find any inconsistency, you want to send an email. So what you do is you insert a record into audit table saying that I found the stored procedure will insert a record into the table that these inconsistencies are found when the database check was run today. Okay, it inserts a record. Now when the record is inserted, you wrote a routine or you wrote a trigger on that table that sends an email to the people in the company that these are the inconsistencies found. Okay, so what you're doing is you're running a stored procedure checking the things in the database, you inserting a record, and on inserting the record the event occurs or the event happens is sending out an email. So on the event of insert to the audit table, the trigger runs and the trigger sends out an email. Okay, so the triggers are basically it will run when you do update, insert or delete on the table. We're talking about the DML trigger. Now the trigger can happen either before or after. Now what is before or after? So excuse me. So before or after means when you're inserting a record in the table, you saying I want to run the trigger before you insert a record or after you insert the record. So there could be two events. When you say I want to insert record into the table, so what the SQL server will do is before inserting any record, it will first run the trigger and then insert the record. Or if it's a before trigger then, but if it's an after trigger, first it will insert the record and then it will run the trigger. So you're defining when do you want to run the trigger, whether it's a before or it's an after insert statement. Okay. All right. So just try to understand this. We're gonna see the examples and everything. But before we talk further about the triggers, what we need to understand is in the triggers you have in the database there are two types of table exist within the trigger. The tables are called inserted and deleted. These table is the name of the table that will be available inside the trigger. Which one? Inserted and deleted. Now why do you have these tables? So these magical tables are available, I said, only inside the trigger. Okay. The use of this table is, let's say you're inserting a record into the table. What happens is first a record will be inserted into this table, okay, and then into your actual table. Okay, so let's say if you're inserting a record into the sales table, first it will make an entry to this magical table which is inserted, and then it will go to the sales table. If you delete, first it will say, okay, this is the record that needs to be deleted. It will be written in the deleted, and then it will be deleted from here. So whenever you delete the record, it will be available into the delete table, or whenever you insert a record, it will be available in the inserted table. Okay, so not the whole table, only the records that you're trying to insert or delete will be available in the respective table. If you're inserting, it will be in the inserted table. If you're deleting the record from the sales, it will be available in the deleted table. Okay, so these tables are only accessible inside the trigger. Okay, nowhere else. So now what if you do an update? You said if it's an insert, you will find it here. If it's a delete, you will find it here. What will happen if you do an update? Where does that record go? In which magical table? It will go in both of them. Why? So think about if you are updating on the sales table, if you are updating a record, this first row, and you are updating the customer type from S to I. Before update, what was the record? Before update, the record is this, right? So this will be available in the inserted table. So whatever update you make, so let's say if we are changing this record, what we have right now is this, right? This is our record. And then if you updating this S to, let's say I, okay, you're updating this record S to I. So now what's gonna happen is this is a new record that you updated to, right? So it's what it assumes is basically this record is deleted from the table. Okay, so it's gonna go to the deleted table, and this record is inserted, right? So when you're updating the data into the table, what you're doing, basically you're removing this record, right? And you're updating this record, you're inserting this record. So that's why whenever you make an update from S to I, the old record will go to the deleted table and the new record will go to the inserted table. Does it make sense? So everything will be available in the inserted table for that row, and the past record will be available in the deleted table for that row. Okay, does it make sense? So the whenever you make an update, where it will be available in both the tables, right? Okay, so that's why you don't have any update for table. Whenever you make a delete, it will be available in whenever you make an update, it will be available in both the tables, the deleted and the inserted table. Okay, all right, so we'll see why do you need the magical tables, how you can use it, but just try to grasp all the terms before we even start talking about that. Okay, so now yes, so we just talked about the updated. When you make an update, what happens? Okay, so now I'm gonna show you is before we do is one of the application we're gonna see how the trigger can be used. Let's say, okay, so what I'm doing is, let's say if I have a table called ID, okay, if I have a table called employee ID, okay, employee ID, EMP ID, and then I have two columns in it, ID and then employee name, okay, that has a character of 10, the data type. Oops. Okay, I say it as e name or employee name. Okay, I have two columns in this table that I created. Now what do you want to do is, oops, let's change it to not this one. All right, SQL training 2017. Okay, so what do I want to do is, I'm creating this table, and what do I want to do is, whenever I make any entry to this table, any insert, any update, any delete to the table, I want to audit this table. Okay, so do you understand? What you want to do is you want to audit this table. So whenever you are making an entry to this table, or you're deleting and you're updating, you want to maintain the log what has been done on this table, right? So if you insert an employee ID 1 and his name, you make an entry to the audit table. If you delete that employee, so you will say in the audit table this record is deleted, right? So you're trying to say whatever is happening with this table, you want to audit it. So whatever happens in here, insert, update or delete, what you're going to do in the audit table, you always going to insert and record into the audit table saying that this thing happened. Does it make sense or no? So let's say, just to make sure you're following it, I'm going to create an employee audit table. Okay, now what audit will do is, let's say if I have an employee ID and if I have an employee name, okay, and I'm saying my employee ID is 1, I'm making an insert to the table ND. Okay, now what happens in the audit table? I want to keep track of audit of this table, right? This employee table. So I create a new table called employee audit table, which has the record called employee ID. Okay, it has the record called employee name, a column called, and then it has what is been done. So let's see what audit has, who did it, when it was done, and what was done. Okay, so who did it is the user who did it, who changed the data in the table. Then when he did it, so it's a date when the record was inserted, and what was the type, whether it's an insert, delete or update. So what did we do in here? We updated record in the ND. So we inserted record ND in here. So I'm going to say in this table, in the audit table, that user X on date whatever 9/20/2017 has inserted a record into the table, right? Now if I make a change from ND to, let's say I put it ND and full name, so what does it should say in the audit table? This record is updated, right? So you're gonna say this record is now updated in the table with this, right? Who did it? Let's say the same user did it, and on the date, let's say 9/21 it was done. It was updated to full name, and what it was done, it was updated. So what he's saying is, in the audit table, the employee ID used to be known as ND, and then he updated his full name. So audit table will keep track of everything what you do in here. So now let's say if you make an entry in here, another one, and you say Adan, what it's gonna do, what you're gonna do in the audit table, you have to say employee ID 2 Adan has inserted by user Y, whoever inserted it, on 9/22, let's say, of 2017, and then when it was done, it was inserted. So you're gonna make an entry in the audit table every time you do anything with here. So let's say you deleted the Adan after a year, he left the company. So what it's gonna do in here, it's gonna say 2 Adan has been deleted by user Z on date 1/1/2018. Okay, and what it was done, it was deleted. So you're gonna make in the audit table that each of the sequence that happens in this table, you're capturing it in here as an audit table. Does it make sense? So if you have to do this kind of audit, you need a trigger. Why you need a trigger? Whenever you're inserting, updating, or delete, you're making a row in this table, right? Does it make sense? Okay, so now you need a trigger to follow these entries into the table. Okay, now how do you do that? So let's say I created this table called employee audit ID, employee audit table, which has ID, and then it has one more column called employee name. So it has the user who did it, on the date it was done, the type, whether it's an insert, delete, and then the employee ID and the name. Okay, so basically this table would be a history table where you can see what are all the things done on the table. When you look at the table, you're gonna find only one record, but you can see how this table went through the changes with the audit table, right? So you can have a history from the audit table. That's what you're trying to maintain. So now you have this employee ID table and employee ID audit. What do you want to do? You always want to insert a record into the employee ID table whenever there is an insert, update, or delete on this table, right? Whenever there is an insert, update, or delete, you always want to enter a record in here saying that these two records by changed by the user on date, and this is the type it was done, right? Okay, so in order to do that, what you need to do is you need to create a trigger on this table, right? So an automatic event happen whenever you do anything to this table. It will be logged in here. It will be logged in here, right? Do a logging in here. So you're saying that I want to create a trigger on this table employee ID whenever there is insert, update, or delete. So you say I want to create a trigger name, let's say is the audit ID, create trigger name on the table. On which table you're trying to create? Employee ID, right? So you're saying that I want to create this trigger called audit ID, or let's say employee audit ID. Okay, employee audit or employee audit, whatever. Okay, so you're saying that I want to create the trigger name employee audit on employee ID table. Okay, take this out, employee ID, just keep it employee audit. Okay, all right. So you're saying that on the employee table I'm trying to create an audit called employee audit. Now when do you want to do it? When do you want to do this audit? After. Okay, you can do either before or after. So whenever the insert is done in this table, or update happens to this table, or delete happens, then insert a record in here. So you say I want to create an after trigger on this one. Okay, you can have either after or before. So you say after the insert happened to this employee table, then my trigger will fire. So whatever routine I'm going to write in this trigger will happens after the insert is done, after insert is finished. Okay, and then you're going to say on which event you want to do it. You say on insert, update, and delete. So you said all three. Either you can just mention only on insert I want to track, or only update and insert I want to track. I don't want to track delete. Or you can just say combination of any of these. Okay, you don't have to say everything. What it's going to do is, if you don't mention the delete in here, so if you delete a record from this table, it's not going to log in this table on delete. It will only log when it's insert or update. Okay, if you don't mention the delete. All right. So let's say we want the audit to be done for everything. Whenever you insert, update, or delete, I want to log the record in the employee audit table. Okay, so create trigger name, and then you say after insert, update, and delete, and as and begin. And as and begin would have your logic. So think about this is as your container, as and begin, and inside you have to do the logic for it. Okay, inside you have to do the logic for it. All right, so the trigger shell or the wrapper is straightforward. Now only you need to do is inside the trigger you need to write a logic for what? For inserting a record into the employee audit table. Okay, you're going to write a routine or a SQL to insert a record into the employee audit table. Now let's say you have to write this thing, right? How do you find out if a record is entered into the table within the trigger? How do you know if the record is inserted into the table? So let's say you make an insert. Once the insert is done, the trigger will fire. Now how the trigger will know whether there is a insert, update, or delete happened on the table? Is there a way you can find out? Yes, you're gonna look in the magical table and you're gonna say, okay, if the record exists in inserted, not in the delete, what does it mean? If the record exists in inserted, not in the delete, what does it mean? It means this table got an insert. What if the record exists in the deleted but not in the insert? It means there is a delete happened on this table. So by looking at the magical tables, you're going to decide whether it's an insert, delete, or update. When there is an update, you're going to find record in both the tables. So if you're updating any of the records, the record will be present in both. So if it's present in both, it means an update is made to the table. Right? Or no? Okay. Right. So how do you determine the insert? You say, okay, count of star from inserted. How many records are there in the inserted table? If the records are greater than 0 in the inserted table, it means it could be either insert or either it could be update. It cannot delete, because if the delete would have been happened, then I won't get any rows in the inserted, right? So what you're doing is you're making sure the inserted has record in it. So you're trying to check if it's an insert or not. So what you do is you look in the magical table and say, if it's an insert, the record should be greater than 0, and at the same time, a record in the deleted table should be 0, right? So if this condition is true, then you're gonna say, I'm gonna insert into the employee table, employee audit table. And for what you're gonna do, you're gonna say, this is an insert made into the employee table, right? So you check the condition. If the magical table inserted has more than 1 row, more than 0 row, it means it's an insert. It could be update as well. Either it could be an insert and update. So you have to make sure it's not an update. So how do you make sure it's not an update? You're going to say in the deleted, there should be nothing, right? So if there is no record in the deleted table, it means it's an insert, right? Because update makes an entry to both of the tables together, in the insert and delete as well. Inserted in the deleted table, right? Okay, so now if this condition is true, you're gonna say, I want to insert into the employee audit table. So this is your audit table. You're gonna insert the username, you're gonna say the date name, you're gonna say the type, ID, and the employee name. Okay, that's what you're gonna insert into the employee table, employee audit table. Okay, so what it says, the user is whoever is running it, the date of today, what it is, it's an insert. So the type is insert. So in the type, you're going to say it's an insert done by the user, who this one on this date. And ID and employee name is, you're going to read from the inserted table what has been inserted into this employee table. Okay, so what I told you, whenever you, let's say, how does the inserted and deleted table will look like? Okay, so let's say if I have an inserted table and I have a deleted table. If I have an inserted table, I'm gonna see a record in the inserted. Okay, and if I have a deleted, if I delete the record Andy from this one, then I'm not gonna see anything in the inserted. I'm gonna see only a record in the deleted table. Okay, all right. So either you're gonna find the record in the deleted when you delete the record from here, or if you, let's say, insert the record in this table, then you're going to find that record in the inserted table. Okay, so the deleted table would not have anything. Okay, all right. So the inserted table will contain both the values that got inserted in the table. So that's all you're doing is you're saying, okay, I'm going to read the ID column and the name column from the inserted table. Okay, so you're reading these two columns because it's available, and then you insert a record. Same thing you do with the delete. How do you find out it's a delete? If the insert table has 0 records and deleted table has more than 0, right? Because in the deleted table, you're going to have a record more than 0, but in the inserted, it's 0, it means it's a delete. So you say, okay, I want to insert a record into the audit table saying user, when it was done, what it was done, it's a delete. You determine, how do you know it's a delete? By checking this condition. If this condition is true, it means it's a delete. So you say the type is delete, and then you're going to read the ID and the employee name from the deleted table, what was deleted. So you're going to read these two columns from the deleted table, what was deleted. Okay, now it's an update. What would you do for update? You say both of the tables should have greater than 0. So if in both of the tables inserted and deleted you found a record, it means it's an update. So you're gonna say I want to insert into the audit table who did it, when it was done, and it was an update. How do you know it's an update? You determined in here, because both of the magical table has more than one row. And then you say this time, because both of the table has record inserted and deleted, what you're interested in when the update was made, you're interested in the record that got updated as new record. So you're going to read from the inserted table. You're not worried about what has been replaced. So let's say if you change the value from S to I, you're interested in what is the new value come in. You're not interested in the old value because the old value is already in your audit table. So let's say when you update this row from S to I, you're interested in the new value, and the new value will be available in where? In the inserted table. So that's why in the update you're reading the data from the inserted table, because you're interested in what's coming in, not what was already in the table, because it's already captured when it was updated or inserted, right? So when the new update is, you want to see what new has been updated to the table. So that's the logic for your SQL in your trigger. So you say, okay, I wrote the logic for insert, update, and delete. I'm going to create a trigger. So let's create first all of these. We're going to create all these two tables, and we're going to create a table on the, we're going to create a trigger on the table employee. Okay, I do this. Okay, so let's do one by one. Okay, I create the audit table, sorry, the employee table. I create the audit table, and then I do is I create, what happens? It's saying that the employee definition, so it's saying that the definition doesn't match column name, or number of supplied values doesn't match with table definition. Oh, okay, because I haven't updated the name, what I'm doing. Okay, that's it. I was using the wrong table name for the audit. I was using old table name, but the table name is employee audit. So if I execute, there is already trigger with this name. So let's say we call it employee audit ID trigger. We name it something else. Okay, all right, so the trigger is created. So now if I look in the database, if I refresh in here, what is the table I created? I created employee, right, EMP, and I created EMP and EMP audit. So I have EMP and EMP audit. Okay, so these are the two tables I created. Whenever I make any changes to this table, it will be logged into this table. It will be logging, right? How it does? Because I have a trigger in here called employee audit ID that will be inserting record into this employee audit table. Okay, so let's see both of the tables now, employee and employee audit. What happens? So right now you have the table called employee, right, and employee audit. Does any of these two tables have a record? There is no record. So let's insert a record into the table called, in the table employee. Okay, I'm gonna make an insert. So if I make an insert into the employee table with employee ID 1 and name is ND, what's gonna happen if I insert a record into the employee table? You're gonna see in both of these tables, right? Because when you insert into this, there was a trigger on the employee table that triggered and insert a record into this one as well. So let's see, when you just insert it into one table, you're gonna find record in both. So see in here, when I insert it into the employee table, I see record in both the tables. And it says in here who is the user who did it, on what date and time it was done, and it was an insert. Did I do an insert on the employee table? Yes, it says insert ID1 and this employee was inserted. Okay, all right. So see, whenever I'm going to make any changes in the employee table, the audit table will reflect it. So let's say I update the ID, or let's say I update the employee table and I update the name of the employee from, let's say I update his name to full name. Okay, and yes. Okay, if I update in the table, what's gonna happen? The employee table will be updated. There will be only one row. It's updated to NDS, and then if you select from the audit table, it will say, okay, the employee ID 1 is updated to update is made on employee ID 1, and the NDS was ND and it changed to NDS. So the user, the date and time it was done, and it was an update, right? I made an update to the table, so it says update. Okay. Now, if I make a delete from the table, from the employee table, what's going to happen? If I make a delete, the record will be deleted from the employee table. I'm not going to find anything in the employee table because I made an insert, I made an update and delete. So if I made a delete, the employee record is gone, but in the audit table, you will find another entry saying that, oops, what's happening? It says, okay, this record is deleted from the table, right? So in the audit table, basically you're tracking what activity is going on in this table. So if you do any of the activity, it will be automatically recorded into the audit table. So the audit tables are used a lot when you want to track what users are doing on your actual table, right? So think about, this is nothing but the history of your things done on this table. So you're storing the history in employee audit table. Does it make sense? So the trigger can be used. So the trigger is doing is, whenever you do anything to this table, the trigger will insert a record in here. So that's what the trigger will do. So based on an event on the one table happened, you're invoking another event. So the event that happened on this table is the insert, update, or delete. You invoke another event on this table, which is called an insert via trigger. So you don't have to do it. You make an insert, the trigger will run and it will insert a record. You update, the trigger will run, it will insert a record. You delete, the trigger will run and it will make a record. So that's why I was saying it's an automatic stored procedure. It does it by itself based on things that you defined in when you're doing the trigger. So if I just do insert or update, I don't do the delete, then whenever you make a delete, it's not gonna make an entry in here because you said don't fire the trigger on delete. So if you delete the record from the table, this entry will not be, you will not find it, because when you define a trigger, you said only do for insert and update, right? Is it clear? Okay, so yes. Yes, so it's stored inside the table. So on whichever table you create, it will be stored inside the table. So let's say if you create a trigger on the department table, it will be stored in the department table trigger. If you create a trigger on the employee table, it will be stored in the employee trigger table. So it's based on what table you create the trigger. So when you create a trigger, you mention that I want to create a trigger on the table name. So this is the name of my trigger, and this is on which table you want to create. So I said I want to create a trigger on employee table, EMP table. The trigger name is this. So if I look in here, EMP, I have a trigger in here called EMP audit ID. So first is the name of the trigger, and the second is on which table you want to create the trigger. Right? And then the trigger inside is just the logic that you're going to put in the SQL to say what you're doing within the trigger. What do you want to do? Whether do you want to insert, you want to update, you want to delete. It could be in any table. It's not necessarily it has to be audit table. You can do same thing in the other table. Let's say if you have student grad and undergrad table, you want to make, you're inserting a record into the undergrad table and you want to make same entry to the grad table as well. So you can have a trigger logic that says, okay, whenever the insert happens, insert into the grad table as well. You know, so it's not necessarily, it's just one application I showed you of the trigger. Okay. All right. So you can do any logic inside the trigger you want. All you need to make sure is you use the inserted and the deleted table, and the inserted and the deleted table are only available inside the triggers. Okay. So if you have to change the trigger, let's say if after a month you have to change the trigger, you right click and you say modify, and it will open the trigger that you have wrote. Okay, so it will open up the trigger. If you want to delete the trigger, you can just right click and you say delete the trigger, or you can say drop trigger name. That's how you drop the object, right? So you say drop trigger name, or drop it. Okay. All right. So altering a trigger, dropping a trigger, and creating a trigger. Okay. When you create a trigger, only you need to say whether it's a after trigger or before trigger, and on which event you want to trigger this trigger that you're creating, on either insert, update, delete, or all, or combination of these three. Okay. All right. So now the next thing that we want to talk about in the SQL Server that is very important is the securities. What are the securities in the SQL Server? Okay, so the securities in the SQL Server, sure. Mm-hmm. So you for the yes, for the email we're not going to show it, because with the email it's very straightforward. All you do is there is a procedure in the database that you can use to send out an email, but I don't have the you need to have SMTP server configured for it to send out an email from the SQL Server. And you need to have an SMTP server, that is a mail server on the SQL Server, needs to be configured, because usually the SQL Server is not configured for sending out an emails. So you have to configure it in your here somewhere, yes, database mail. So you have to configure it from which email you want to send it, how do I access the email, and everything, because when you're sending it in email you need an email to send out. So once it's configured, you can use a stored procedure for sending out an email. So let's say it's called sp_send email, send db mails. So you can use this stored procedure in SQL Server that comes with all the, so it has parameters that will require you the body of the email, whom you want to send it. So SP, if you execute this procedure in your trigger, okay, so who you need to mention all this: who is the recipient, what is the from address, what is the reply to address, what is the subject, body format. So it's basically your in SQL you need to pass. So this is a stored procedure, and you pass all these as parameters. You don't have to pass everything, only you need to pass which ones are required, basically from address, reply to address, subject, body, and that's it. So if you mention these 4 parameters in spdb email and you run that and you have configured the email, it will send out an email. So all you need to do is in your trigger you need to call this procedure instead of this whole thing. You're gonna say, okay, whenever there is an insert on this table, I want to execute sp underscore db, which one it is, sp send underscore, it's an sp db email. Okay, so you can use this procedure and then you can put all the parameters one by one. What's your whom you want to send it, from which address you want to send it, then what's the body, what's the format. Okay, so then it will send out an email. But once you have database email configured in this trigger, this process will run. Yep. All right, good. All right, so but usually the emails are, you don't need to worry about setting up the server with the email. How do you set up? You don't need to worry about it. It's all done by the DBA. So okay, so now what do you want to talk about next is the securities in the SQL Server. Now how does the security plays a role in the SQL Server? Because the SQL Server is not open, not anyone can access it. The people, so let's say when I say this is my server which is available online, it doesn't mean that anyone can access it. You need to have a user ID and login in order to get into the server, right? So those are nothing but implemented via security in the SQL Server. Now, the security has three things: permissions, principals, and securables. Okay, permissions, principals, and securables. Now, what are these three things inside the securities? The permissions, it means if I'm giving you the access, what kind of access I'm giving you? I'm just giving you the read access. It means you can only read, you cannot insert, update, delete the data. You can only do a select. If I give you just the write access, it means you can only insert the data. You cannot read or you cannot read it. Basically, you can just write or delete. Okay. If I give you the execute, then you can execute just the stored procedures. Okay. If I give you create, then you can only create. So there are different permissions that you can give you to the user. Okay. Then what is principal? Principals are those whom you're trying to give an access. Okay. So let's say if I give you the access, so you become the principal. So the permissions are given to whom is the principal. Okay. It's an actual user whom you're trying to give in permission. And now, so what you do is you give permissions to the principals on securables. Now, what are securables? When you're giving a permission to a principal, you're doing it on securables. It means you are giving access to particular person on a database or on the table or on the server, right? So either it could be the server, database, or object. So let's say if I give you the access to my server, I might not give you access to all. I just give you access to this particular database, which is your name, and to the AdventureWorks, these two. So what I'm doing is I'm giving you the permissions. So I'm giving the permissions to the principals on securables. So the securables are the databases. So did you understood what is permission, principal, and securables, right? So securables are the objects or the servers of the databases. Principal is the person whom I'm trying to give, and what kind of permissions I'm giving to that person is the permissions. Okay, so now in the SQL Server, let's try to understand how the security is implemented. So in order to get into the SQL Server, the person has to have access first to the server. Okay, just he needs to have access to server in order to get in. If you give him the if you don't give him access to the server, he won't be able to log in into the server. Okay, so first entry point is he needs to have access to the server. Okay, that's what the first access they get. We don't get into the detail how they give the access, what access they get. All we're trying to understand is what kind of access are available. So first you give a person access at the server level. So if you see in here, I have created the login, which is your name and other people name in here, right? So these are all the people who can access the server. Now, when I give you the access, this is at the server level access. It doesn't mean that you can access these databases. Because I give you the server at the access level, I didn't give you the access to the database. So once I give you the access to the server, then I decide on which database I'm going to give you the access. So if you see in AdventureWorks and in securities, it will show in the user Adan has access to this. User Adan has access to this database. But if you look at the other, which is Sarah, in securities, you're not going to find your name in here because you don't have access to this database. So what I'm trying to say in here, even I give you the access to the server, you might not be able to access anything until I give you access to the database or any of the objects. Okay, so the first user get access to the server, and then he gets access to the database. Okay, and inside the database, you can have permissions defined on objects individually. So if I give you the access to the database, it doesn't mean I give you the complete on all and everything, all the objects of the database. I can define on object level. I can give you access to the tables, some functions, you know. I can give you access to some stored procedure, not everything. Okay, I can define that. If I want to give you everything, it's okay. But the granularity is you can define on each object which object you can access. So that's the granularity. You can define the permissions for the person on the object level, okay, within the database. So you get access to the server, you get access to the database, and within the database you can define on each object which objects you can access. Either I can give you the whole, or if I don't want to give you the whole database, I can define which object you can access. Okay, so this is this is how the level goes: server, database, and then I can define the permissions. Now when I'm giving you access to the object, I need to say, so I giving you give you the permission, so it means you are the principals and these are the securables, right? You is the principal and the securables is these. Now I have to define what kind of permission I'm going to give you on my server, on my database, and on the object. On the server, I can just give you login access, okay? And you cannot do anything. You cannot delete the databases. You cannot add a user who can access the database. So on the server, I just give you the login. On the database, I can make you, on the AdventureWorks, I made you the read only. It means you can only read from the AdventureWorks. You cannot delete the data from the AdventureWorks, okay? So I'm trying to define the permission, what kind of permission you can have AdventureWorks, because the AdventureWorks is a database that's used by everybody, so I don't give access to you or to any people who join the class. I don't give them access to AdventureWorks as alter or delete or insert or update. I just give them the read access. So you can read the data, you can write the select on this table, but you cannot delete or update this data, okay? But on the other hand, I can give you on your database access to everything. You can do whatever you want within the database, in the Adan database, okay? You can create tables, you can delete tables, you can update data, you can insert data, you can do anything, but you cannot delete the database. I give you the permissions just to do anything inside the database, okay? Does it make sense? So when I'm giving you the permissions on the object, I define different kind of permissions, what you can do within my database, okay? What are the roles you have? So in here you have full permission, you can do anything you want. Create tables, execute stored procedures, create stored procedure, delete stored procedure. Because that's your database, you can do anything in here, okay? So the securities helps the user what kind of permission you want to give, because you don't want the user to have more than access. You don't want to give them more access what they need, because sometimes, let's say the new employee joins in my company, okay? We don't give them access more than read initially, because we don't know how person is competent to do the things. What if he's suddenly gone to the database and he by mistake deletes it? So that's why you have to be protective about the permissions when you're giving them. You need to first make sure what kind of permissions you're giving to each person, and then once he's get used to the database, then you give him more permissions slowly. So in that way you protect your database by the permissions. So these permissions also make sure that the people cannot get into the database and hack the database. It makes this database secure by having the permissions, okay? So we don't need to go into detail how to do it, because you're not going to do the permissions. All this is done by the DBA, the database administrator, okay? All this, all this done can be, it's done by SQL. So all you do is, let's say if I have to create a new user, okay, in here. So I say I want to create a new login. So everything is done by here. So let's say I want to create one more login with Adan, let's say S. I want to give you 2 access, okay? So I say the login name, and then I say it's a SQL Server authentication, and then I put the password in here, okay, for you, whatever it is. And then I say Adan and then S. So I'm creating in here, and then I go on the server role, what kind of server role I want to give. So I just say public means you can just log in on my server. You don't have access to the database, yes. And then in the user mapping, not user mapping, the securable, sorry. The securables or the user, let's say the user mapping, I want to give access to the database which is called Adan. So I say in here, to the Adan database, I want to make him the owner of the database. It means he can do anything. But to the AdventureWorks, this user can only do, in here he can only read the database. So I say, okay, he is a data reader. So for the AdventureWorks, I made you the data reader, but for the Adan, I made you the owner. So you can do anything inside this one. Okay, so that's how you give the permissions on the securables. So On the server role, so this is basically where you are getting access to the server. I don't give you access like server admin, setup admin. These are more like very high level permissions. It's more than what you can do is you can, if I give you any of these server admin, you might be able to delete all the databases that I have, you know. So that's why I was saying that you just give the login access and then you say, okay, what database I want to give access. Now let's say if I don't want to give the whole database access, what I can do is I can take this out, and in the securables I can say which object I want to give you access. So on the securables you can define each object at each object level. So you say on a specific object I want to give you the access. So you say on the object type, which is I think in here you cannot do, because it's a server level, but you go into the database and then you can have search for the object and you can do by object as well. So I want to give you only particular object access. So you go in the securables and you can give the access via particular object. Okay. So it's just one interface in here in the securities, and you can do everything. And if you want to do at the database level security, then you go into the database security, and let's say if I want to change your permissions on this database, I go to add-on and then I can go to the securables tab and I can change your permissions on the on this database, right? Because you have permissions to add-on and you have AdventureWorks. And if I'm trying to adjust your permissions on the add-on database, I go onto the securables and I say, okay, on this specific object, on the object type, which is stored procedure or tables, whatever you want to pick. So let's say I pick the stored procedure, I click OK, and then I want to do browse. So these are all my stored procedures, and I can say I want to give you access to, let's say, stored procedure, one of the stored procedure that I'm so you pick like one of the stored procedures that I want to give you access, and I say, okay, I want to give you this access. I click OK, and here it says, okay, this is a stored procedure. What kind of access do you want to give add-on to the stored procedure? Execute, or if I give you the execute, it means you can only execute this procedure, you cannot alter it. If I give you the alter, you can alter it. I give you the ownership, it means you can give access to this stored procedure to someone else who is in the database, you know. All right, so if I give you this access, it means you can assign someone who can access this stored procedure. So you get the ownership, so you can say, okay, Andy can use this stored procedure, or any new people come in, you have the ownership to give the access. Okay, if I do view definition, it means you can, if I don't give you any of these, the view definition will only allow you to see the stored procedure. You cannot execute, you cannot alter, you cannot do anything. You can just see the stored procedure is there. So these are the different types of permissions you have on each object. So this just we talked about stored procedure. If you pick another object from here, let's say tables, okay, and you browse the tables, and then you say, okay, these are the two tables that you have in your database. You click OK, and you click OK. So this object appears in here. Now I can define the permissions, what you can do. So see, as soon as the object is changed, the permissions are changed, because with the tables you can do alter, delete, insert, select, ownership, update, you know, definition. So these are the permissions that I can give you on the table in your database. Okay, so that's why I was saying you first give access to the server at the server level, then to the database, and then even you can control it at the object level. So everything is done via just this securities in your database or the securities in your server. The DBA do from here. Okay, so okay, Glishan joined in. Okay, so we just talked about the securities. Now the next thing that I want to quickly wrap up with the backups and the restore. Okay, so just you're not gonna get into this much, but I want you to know what are backups and restore. So what is backup and restore means? Let's say I mean, the name suggests what is backup and restore. Basically you take a copy of the database, and let's say if you want to restore that backup, you restore that the copy that you have taken. So basically you're making a copy of the database. How it would be useful, and why do you need the backup? So let's say it will be helpful when you have a disaster in your company. Let's say something happened and it's used for disaster scenarios. Okay, so let's say this Harvey came right in the Texas recently. What happens is, let's say if someone have their data center there, their server is there, everything is wiped off from their server. If they don't have any backup, would they be able to recreate their system? No, right? So what they do is, when they have the system and if something goes wrong with their servers or the systems, they need to restore that data back onto another server, right? It's just not everything can go away. They have to have the copy of the database to restore. So what they do is, when they have their servers on the in the Texas, they have I mean, like where the disaster hit, they were making the backups of the databases based on how much data they can lose. So let's say if you making a backup every day, or you making a backup every week, or you making a backup every hour, or every 4 hours, or every 8 hours. So the thing depends on how much data loss you can afford. I know the loss is, no one can afford the data loss, but it comes on cost. So let's say if you're doing backup every minute, it comes with lot of cost. You need to have very huge servers that can do that, that can store that amount of information. So it comes with the cost, and the company is not able to make up the cost that they need it for every minute, right? So there is always a trade-off with the cost and with the data loss, right? The more data loss you can afford, the less is the cost. The less data loss you need is higher the cost. Does it make sense? So when, let's say if the company can afford a data lost for 1 day, so let's say if something happens today in the midnight, if I lose the data for whatever done in the database, I'm fine with it. Okay, I can afford 1 day loss of data, but I cannot afford to lose the data whatever I'm doing for my last 10 years, right? So my thing is, I can lose 1 day of data. So what you do is, every midnight you run the backups. Okay, so when you're running the backup, you're storing it somewhere at the remote location, not in the same data center. If you do this at the same place, the whole center get wiped off and your backups wiped off. So you don't do that. The backups are stored somewhere else. So let's say in the Texas, every night I have the company, the backup runs every night. Okay, and let's say if the Harvey came today evening and it wiped off my server, I still have the backup from the last night. So if I have to restart my system, let's say in Michigan, I can do is I can restore my data from my last night backup, right? So I'm not gonna have the information what I have on my server, but I have at least the data from my last night from my backup. Okay, so the backups are used for recover in the disaster scenario. Not necessarily, it can be used, let's say if a DBA joins in the company and by mistake he deletes the server, or he intentionally deletes everything from the company, right? So the backup can be used to restore. I'm just giving an example. Or let's say if the developer comes in, by mistake he deletes the database. If he deletes, then you need to restore, or you need to get the data. So you use the backup to restore what has been deleted. Okay, so the backup and restore are used for getting back your data, but it doesn't mean that you're gonna get everything. Okay, so there are different kind of backups that you can do on the SQL server. Okay, so there is a full we just talk about like what are the different types of backups. There are three types of backup: full backup, differential backup. Okay, you don't need to get into the much, but I'm just saying that there are different types of backups that you can do on the database: full, differential, and then it's a log backup. Okay, so now what does the full backup do is it takes the full database backup. Whatever you have in the database, the backups are run on the database first thing. Okay, whenever you're running on the backups, you run on the database, which database you want to back up. Okay, or you can even back up all the databases on the server, but you do it by database. You can back up everything on the server, but you do by database. Each individual database are backed up individually. Okay, so when you say full backup, it will copy everything whatever you have in the database. Okay, all right. The differential backup now. So let's say what is the full backup means. So let's say today if I do a backup and my data in the system is, so every day, let's say every day I'm taking a backup, right? In the night, each day my data increases by 1 gig. Okay, what I'm saying is I do a backup every night and each day my data get increases by 1 gig. Okay, so let's say starting of this week I had data at 10 gig in my system. Okay, 10 GB. When I take this next day, what would be the backup size? Every 11. Each day 1, right? So the next day if you take the backup, what would be the size of backup? 12. The next day you take it, it would be 13. So think about every day you're taking a backup and you have these huge files and you're keeping everything. You don't want to lose everything, so you keep everything. So now how big disk space you would need when you are taking these backups every day, right? Because it's exponential, it's increasing day by day, right? So the total space you would need to store this information is 46 gigabyte, right? And then if you do next day, it's 14 more, so it's like 60 gig. So every day you're taking a backup, you need more space, 60 gig, then 75, then 91, I guess, right? In this way you're gonna go and you're gonna have need more space every time. So is this the resource consuming? Because you're taking everyday backup, it's taking a lot of disk space, it's going to grow exponentially. So what SQL Server will do is it offers you the differential backup. So the differential backup, what it does is, so you do a full backup and then you do a differential backup after that. Okay, what I'm saying is you do a full backup and then you do a differential backup. So the let's say this is about the full backup, but let's say what you're doing is you do full backup and then you take the differential backup. So when you take a differential backup, your size is only 1 gig. So the size is calculated from the last full backup. Okay, you took the full backup first. So differential backup always starts with full. So let's say you're saying that we take the differential backup. So in order to do the differential backup, the first backup has to be full and then you can do the differential after that. Okay, so the first day you get 10 gig. Okay, in the full backup. The next day you do a differential backup. Okay, you do a full and then you keep doing the differential. So if you do the differential, what would be the size? It's just the data that got increased from the full backup. Okay, so then it will be only 1 gig. So think how many gig you reduced when you did the differential. You reduced by 10 gig, right? Then when you do the next day, what would be the differential backup size? It will be 2 gig only. So it takes the backup from your full backup. So right, so it will be 2. Then when you take the full when you take the differential on third day, it will be 3 gig. So the differential is calculated from your full backup size. Okay, so after full backup, how much data is increased? On the third day, your data size is 13 gig, but you took the full backup, so your differential size would be 3. The next day you take it's 4. Okay, so think now, instead of 64 or whatever 46, how much it is now? Instead of 60, it's just now 16 plus 4, 20. So instead of 60, you are taking only 20 gig, right? That's more sensible, right? So that's why the SQL Server provides full and differential backup. 40, 1, 2, 3, 4, and then you keep taking differential. Okay, so what you do is you have to decide till when you want to do the differential. You don't want to differential, keep doing the differential now. So what they do is every week they take the full backup and then they do the differential for all the week in between. On each Sunday they take the full backup and then they take the differential backup between the week on the except Sundays. So within the week they take the differential, on each Sunday they do the full. Okay, does it make sense? So your differential, so let's say now it's the day for the full backup again. It's a Sunday, come back to Sunday. By the Sunday you have it 17 gig. So you do on the Sunday again 17 gig, and then the next day it's increasing by 1. So you take 1 and then again 2, then 3, right? Okay, so from this, so this is your last week of data and this is your new next week of data. I mean like 1 week after. Okay, so they do is like they do one full and then they do the differential. Why they don't keep doing the differential if it's a small size? because when you have to restore the database, you need to have all your differential and your full backup. So it sometime you because it will be your full and then you need the differential. So it's always easier to have your full and then your differential. You don't want to keep doing the differential. Okay, so it's always easier to restore from when you have to restore. It helps. Okay, so that's why you do full every time, every week. So you're trying to avoid this space. Now don't worry about the log backup. So let's say the log backup is usually when you want to do, so this is every day, right? Now let's say some company have the requirement they cannot lose more than 15 minutes of data. So what they do is after this, once they do the full backup, after they do every 15 minutes, they do the log backup, which is like very small size database. Okay, so what it does is after every 15 minutes, it just captures the 15 minutes of data, nothing else. Every 15 minutes, it just captures the 15-minute data. So it's a very small portion of the database. So it just captures only 15 minutes. After every 15 minutes, it keeps kicking up and taking the log database. So the log backup is not, it's very different than full and differential. So what I'm saying is, it's not, these three are independent, all are dependent to each other. So you can have just full, or when you do just full and differential, so you need to have the full. You cannot do just differential. You need to have first full, then you do the differential. Same with the log backup. You cannot just do the log backup. You need to have full, and you need to have differential, and you need to have log backup as well. But the log backup helps, or the differential, to minimize the data burden that you're backing up every time. Okay, so but the more types of backups you take, so let's say if you take all these three, when you restore, you need to restore all these three. That becomes the pain. Okay, so the more data you're trying to the many number of times you're trying to do backup, that much is the pain to restore it. Okay, so it's not easy. Even if you're saying, let's say I cannot lose more than 15 minutes of data, it means it's not easier. It's more complex because you have to restore so many number of files that you have backed up when you try to restore. Okay, all right. So backup process, and then when you do the restore, there are different kind of, sorry, I didn't mean to take this away. Okay, now when you do a restore, there are different you restore the database. Okay, with these backups. I think that should be it for backup and restore. But you understood the concept, what are backups, what is full, differential. If someone says, then you know at least what those are. It's not necessarily you have to know everything. It's just when people are talking, you won't be like, what is going on, you know? Yeah. Usually, I mean, you can do the backup from here. So if you go to the task and then you do the backup, and it does the backup for you. So if I click on backup, usually it's stored at a different location. You don't store it on the server. If you take a backup for this server on this server, you always do it on the different, but you do it from here. So let's say I want to take up the database name, which I want to backup, the backup type, full, differential, or the log backup. So you pick this, and then you say the location, and then you click OK. It's going to do the backup. So these things are very straightforward. Doing it is not easy. Just understanding it. So see, the securities I showed you, it's just one tab you open and you do the security. For the database backup, so the things are not complex. The most important part is like writing queries and everything. Those are more complex than doing these things, believe me. Yeah. And I guess so let's say when you have the backup and you want to restore something, you right click on the database, you go to the task, and you have the restore. So you want to restore the database, you click, and then you pick where the restore file is, or the backup file is basically that you want to restore. It takes a little time. to come up. While it's opening, I don't know what's still working on, I guess. Oh, I know. Let's try in here because that server is slow, so that's why. So if I do task restore database, see, it comes up quickly. So what you do is you say from where you want to, where do you have the backup? You go in here, you browse, right, and then you say on which database you want to do a backup. That's it. And then once you have your backup file, you pick that file and then you click OK. Okay. Yeah, you don't need to. I mean, there is, you can write these things in the SQL, you know, there's a SQL for it that you can write it. But doing these things are very simpler from the GUI, you know, from here. Okay, so backup restore, and then I guess what else do we need to talk about is we talked about backups and restore, and then yes, and there is just one more thing is the recovery model. When you have the database, it runs under certain recovery model. Now what does it helps is when you have to recover the database, when you're doing a backup and restore, that's okay. But when you have to recover the database, there are different modes of the database that it runs in. So if I go to the properties, you can see the database is running in which mode. So if I go to options for the databases, that's where you can see the database can run in recovery model: full, bulk log, and simple. What is these three recovery models? So whenever your the database is, it runs under either of these three modes: full, bulk, and simple. Now what does this recovery model do when you say full, bulk, and simple? The recovery model helps what kind of logging do you do on the SQL server. So when you do a full, it means it logs everything, each and everything you do on the system. Each and everything that it's done on this database will be logged in your LDF file. Okay, so the recovery model will decide how the logging will be done on LDF. Do you remember when we started, we talked about the MDF file, metadata file, and the LDF file. The LDF file is nothing but the log data file which logs everything that you do on your MDF, right? The log data file keeps an entry, who is accessing what is inserted, what is deleted. So what should be written and what detail that needs to be written in the log data file would be based on the recovery model. So when you say full recovery mode, it writes everything in very detailed fashion into the log data file. But when you save the bulk log, it's a bulk. When you're running the database in the bulk log, what it does is the detail for the logging is reduced. And when you say simple recovery model, then your logging is very minimal for the database things that you do. Okay, now how does it affect? Why do you, so which one would be better? It's always good to have full logging, right? So that whenever something goes wrong, it's basically, it can be used for recovering the things that you have done on the database by mistake. It can be used for that. Or let's say if disaster happens and you have to recover something, that bulk the full logging would get you most of the data. But if you have simple, it won't give you most of the data. But when you have the full logging, it comes up with the cost. The server becomes slow because it has to write so many logs when you're entering anything. So let's say if you're doing insert, update, delete, it has to write each and every log in very detailed fashion. So your server responds little slow because when you're trying to log so many things. Okay, so the slowness is on the cost of your recovery. When you try to recover your database, you can recover most out of it. But when you have simple, you might not recover the most out of it, but your database will be faster when you're in your routine process. Okay, So these are the three recovery models that it can be running on. I mean, these things, as you don't need to worry much about this, even though you can come across backup very quick, but the recovery model you're not going to come across until 2-3 years. So, but that's why I didn't go much into the detail. So I guess that should be it for the databases. As I suggested, try to look for the exam 1938-364, and then the book that you can refer is the same thing, which is published by the Microsoft for 98-364 book. Okay, that is available. You can download. It's a full book that will help you to prepare for the exam certification. Okay. Yeah, I think you will be able to find the PDF as well. Yeah. Yeah, I'm gonna send you today now. Yeah, I'm gonna send you that. Yeah. I'm gonna send you the questions that you can expect from the interview, or what kind of questions that you can see in the interview. It's mostly that we want discussed in the class. It will be from those only, but you can have all those questions in one place because we have so many classes and we have talked about those. You might not have everything in together, so I can send you those. I think there's a Glishan there. He was gone for something and he joined in back. Yeah. Yeah. Okay. Yeah. And so the Glishan, I think that's it. If you have any